David walked hurriedly down the busy New York street. His impeccable suit and leather briefcase showed that he was a busy businessman. The morning sun cast shadows between the skyscrapers, and he was absorbed in the plans of the day. A small, lean figure appeared in front of him, a teenage girl in shabby clothes and disheveled hair. She stared at him with pleading eyes. "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you, but could you help me with anything to eat?" the girl asked hesitantly. David stopped for a moment, looking at her. His thoughts about the day's meetings dissipated for an instant as he considered the situation. "Sorry, I don't have time right now," he finally replied, resuming his quick step. The girl stood there for a moment, watching him move away. The disappointment on her face was visible before she turned around and blended back into the crowd. The next day, David met again with the same girl on the same busy street. She approached him with the same pleading look as he walked hurriedly towards work. "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you again, but can you help me with something to eat?" asked the girl shyly. David stopped for a moment, looking at her. Indecision gripped him for an instant, but after a short pause, he firmly replied, "I'm sorry, I can't help." The girl lowered her eyes in disappointment as David continued on his way. But this time, something changed inside him. Throughout the day, he found himself thinking about the girl and how he might have responded differently. Her words echoed in his mind, making him question his own actions and privileges. At work, his mind wandered between the day's reports and plans, but his thoughts kept coming back to that brief interaction on the street. He found himself reflecting on his own social responsibilities and how he could do more to help those less privileged. As the day progressed, David felt increasingly restless. The girl's presence and her precarious situation weighed on his conscience in a way he couldn't ignore. The next morning, as expected, David met again with the same girl on the busy New York street. She approached him with a hopeful look, clearly recognizing him from the previous interaction. "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you again, but can you help me with something to eat?" the girl asked, her voice revealing a mixture of shame and need. David stopped, determined to act differently this time. He looked into her eyes with compassion. "Of course," he replied, with a softness in his voice that had not been present before. "I'll buy you something to eat." He took her to a nearby diner and bought her a sandwich and a drink. The girl thanked shyly, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, sir," she said, accepting the meal with trembling hands. David sat next to the girl as she ate the sandwich, watching her with genuine interest. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Alice," she answered shyly, her eyes still downcast. "It's nice to meet you, Alice," David said, trying to comfort her with a gentle smile. "What do you do here every day?" Alice sighed before she began to speak, as if letting go of a weight she had carried for a long time. "I live with my grandmother in a small apartment across town," she began, looking at the sandwich in her hands. "My mother died when I was little, and my father, he disappeared a few years ago. My grandmother is sick and cannot work, so I come here to try to get something for us." David listened intently, feeling a pinch in his heart as he heard Alice's story. He could see the sadness and determination mixed in her young eyes. "You are brave, Alice," he said sincerely. "It must be very difficult for you." Alice shrugged, but a slight smile appeared on her tired face. "It is what it is," she murmured. "Sometimes it's hard, but we turn around." David nodded, admiring the girl's resilience in the face of so many difficulties. "I would like to help more," he said sincerely. "You and your grandmother. Is there anything else I can do?" Alice looked surprised at the offer, her eyes lighting up with new hope. "Would you do that?" she asked, not quite believing it. David nodded with a reassuring smile. "Yes, Alice. I'd like to help." After hearing Alice's story and sharing a genuine moment with her, David stood up and took some change out of his pocket. "Alice, here's some money for you," he said, holding out the money to her. "That should help a little." Alice looked at the money with mixed surprise and gratitude on her tired face. "Thank you, sir," she murmured, accepting the money carefully. David smiled gently. "You are welcome, Alice. I'll think of something else to help you and your grandmother." Alice nodded, her eyes shining with the new hope he had helped ignite. "Thank you very much, Mr. David," she said, carefully storing the money in her battered purse. David nodded and said goodbye before making his way towards work. David watched her for a moment, feeling a mixture of relief at having done something good and a twinge of sadness at the difficult reality she faced every day. After making sure she was okay, David continued on his way toward work, but this time, his heart was lighter. The small action he had taken seemed to have made a significant difference, not only to the girl, but also to himself. Upon arriving home that evening, David shared with his wife, Emily, about the meaningful encounter he had with the girl on the street. He described how Alice, despite being so young, faced profound difficulties caring for her ailing grandmother. "I can't stop thinking about her, Emily," David said with a serious countenance as they sat together on the living room sofa. "She is just a child, but she carries such a heavy burden. I want to help her somehow." Emily listened intently, worried by the determined expression on her husband's face. "Do you think you can do something for her?" Emily asked, placing her hand on his. David sighed, pondering his options. "I gave a little bit of money today, but I know that doesn't solve her problem," he admitted. "We need to think of something more substantial, something that can really make a difference in her and her grandmother's lives." Emily nodded, understanding the seriousness of the situation. She knew how dedicated David could be when he committed to something important to him. "Maybe we can call some shelters or charitable organizations tomorrow," Emily suggested. "See if they have any programs that can help Alice and her grandmother." David agreed, feeling grateful for Emily's support and understanding. "You're right," he said, a slight smile appearing on his face. "Let's see what we can do together." The next morning, David found Alice again in the same place. She greeted him shyly, but with a gleam of hope in her eyes. "Hi, Alice," David said, smiling gently at her. "I've been thinking about how I can help you and your grandmother." Alice nodded, her eyes shining with gratitude for the attention and the promise of help. "Thank you, Mr. David," she murmured. David put his hand in his pocket and pulled out a pack of bullets. "Here are some bullets for you to sell today," he said, extending the package to her. "That should help you make money at the end of the day." Alice picked up the bullets carefully, looking at David with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Thank you very much, Mr. David," she said again, her eyes waterlogged. David smiled and nodded. After making sure Alice had everything she needed, David made his way to work, feeling light that he had found a tangible way to support the girl and her grandmother. He was determined to continue helping them in the best way he could. By the end of the work, David felt a mixture of anxiety and expectation. When he reached the point where he usually found Alice, he saw her sitting in the same place, but this time with a more animated expression. "Alice," he called, approaching with a smile on his face. "How was your day?" Alice stood up quickly, holding the almost empty pack of bullets. She smiled at David, her face lit up with happiness. "It was great, David," she exclaimed. "I managed to sell almost all the bullets and made good money. This will greatly help my grandmother and me." David felt a surge of satisfaction and relief when he heard those words. Seeing the joy and gratitude in Alice's eyes made all the effort worthwhile. "I'm very glad to hear that, Alice," he said, smiling. "You did an excellent job." Alice nodded vigorously. "Thank you, Mr. David. I can't thank you enough for everything you've done for me today." David put his hand on her shoulder, offering an encouraging look. "You deserve it, Alice. And that's just the beginning. I will think of more ways to help you and your grandmother." Alice looked hopeful as she packed the few remaining bullets in her battered bag. "Thank you, Mr. David. I can't wait to tell my grandmother." David smiled again before saying goodbye. "See you tomorrow, Alice." Walking home, David felt truly happy. Helping Alice had given a renewed sense to her day. He was determined to continue supporting her and find more ways to make a difference in her and her grandmother's lives. Upon arriving home, David shared the good news with Emily. They talked about Alice's day and what more they could do to provide lasting support. The next morning, David went on his usual way to the place where he used to meet Alice. However, when he got there, he did not see her. He looked around, looking for the girl, but she was nowhere to be found. A feeling of worry began to arise, but he tried to push it away. Maybe she had found a better place to sell the bullets, or maybe she was taking care of her grandmother. Determined not to let himself get knocked down, David continued on his way to work, but he couldn't help but let thoughts of Alice occupy his mind. He wondered if she was okay, if something had happened. Throughout the day, he found himself looking at his watch more often than usual, eager to be able to go back and look for her again. When the working day finally came to an end, David quickly left the office and returned to the place where he usually found Alice. He looked around, but again, there was no sign of her. The worry began to turn into a sense of urgency. The day after not finding her, David decided to take a different approach. He stopped at a few shops and restaurants in the area, asking traders if they had seen Alice. He described it and explained the situation briefly. Some vaguely remembered seeing her in recent days, but no one knew where she had gone. David did not give up. He kept asking who he met, determined to find out what had happened to Alice. When he was almost losing hope, he met a lady selling flowers on the corner of a street. "Yes, I saw the girl," said the lady. "She told me that her grandmother was very sick and that she needed to come home early yesterday." David felt a mixture of relief and worry. He thanked the lady and decided he would look up Alice's address to make sure everything was okay. David returned home that night with a heavy heart, his mind still full of thoughts about Alice. Emily immediately noticed the concern on her husband's face as he walked through the door. "David, are you okay?" she asked, putting her hand on his shoulder. "You seem disturbed." David sighed and sat down on the couch, running his hand through his hair. "It's about the girl Alice," he replied, his voice tinged with frustration. "I didn't find her today. I've asked a few people, but no one knows where she is. I'm worried about what might have happened." Emily sat next to him, holding his hand firmly. "You really got attached to this girl, didn't you?" she said softly. David nodded, looking at the clasped hands. "Yes, Emily. She touched me in a way I didn't expect. Knowing that she is out there, facing so many difficulties, makes me want to help. I can't get it out of my head." Emily smiled slightly, admiring her husband's compassion. "I understand, David, but you did what you could for her. Sometimes these things are out of our control." David sighed again, shaking Emily's hand. "I know, but I can't help but feel like I need to do more. If only I knew where she lives, I could check to see if she and Grandma are okay." Emily thought for a moment before answering. "Maybe we can try again tomorrow. Look in other areas, talk to more people. And if we still can't find her, we can think of other ways to help children like Alice. Maybe through a charity or something." David looked at Emily gratefully, feeling a little lighter. "You always know what to say, Emily," he said with a smile. "We will try this tomorrow. And thank you for supporting me." Emily smiled and kissed David's forehead. "We're in this together. We'll find a way to help, one way or another." A week passed, and although concern for Alice still hung in his mind, David had begun to calm down, accepting that perhaps she was being cared for in some way. But that morning, as he rounded the corner on his way to work, he finally found her. Alice was leaning against a wall, looking even more dejected and tired than before. His eyes were red and swollen, and his countenance conveyed a deep sadness. "Alice," called David, hurrying up to her. "Where have you been? I was so worried." Alice raised her head slowly, her eyes glazed with fatigue and pain. "Hi, Mr. David," she replied, her voice almost a whisper. "My grandmother, she's dead." David felt a pang in his heart as he heard those words. The sadness in Alice's eyes was overwhelming, and he felt a surge of compassion and responsibility. "Oh, Alice, I'm sorry," he said, kneeling beside her. "I wish I had known that I could have helped sooner." Alice let out a sob, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know what to do," she said, her voice trembling. "She was so sick, and I had no one to ask for help." David reached out and held Alice's hand, feeling the urgency to do something for her. "You're not alone, Alice," he said firmly. "Let's go through this together. I will help you find a safe place to stay." Alice looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, as if she could not believe his kindness. "Thank you, Mr. David," she murmured. "I don't know what I would have done without you." A week passed, and although concern for Alice still hung in his mind, David had begun to calm down, accepting that perhaps she was being cared for in some way. But that morning, as he rounded the corner on his way to work, He finally found her. Alice was leaning against a wall, looking even more dejected and tired than before. His eyes were red and swollen, and his countenance conveyed a deep sadness. "Alice," called David, hurrying up to her. "Where have you been? I was so worried." Alice raised her head slowly, her eyes glazed with fatigue and pain. "Hi, Mr. David," she replied, her voice almost a whisper. "My grandmother, she's dead." David felt a pang in his heart as he heard those words. The sadness in Alice's eyes was overwhelming, and he felt a surge of compassion and responsibility. "Oh, Alice, I'm sorry," he said, kneeling beside her. "I wish I had known that I could have helped sooner." Alice let out a sob, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know what to do," she said, her voice trembling. "She was so sick, and I had no one to ask for help." David reached out and held Alice's hand, feeling the urgency to do something for her. "You're not alone, Alice," he said firmly. "Let's go through this together. I will help you find a safe place to stay." Alice looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, as if she could not believe his kindness. "Thank you, Mr. David," she murmured. "I don't know what I would have done without you." After a quiet dinner, David helped Alice settle on the couch with a cup of hot tea. While Alice was getting ready, Emily called David to a corner of the kitchen, away from the girl's ears. Her face was serious, her eyebrows furrowed in concern. "David, what's going on?" Emily asked, her voice low but firm. "You brought this girl into our house without consulting me and without even knowing her properly." David sighed, knowing that this conversation was inevitable. He looked at Emily, trying to find the right words. "Emily, I know it sounds like an impulsive decision, but Alice really needs our help. She is alone, with no one to take care of her. I couldn't just leave her on the streets." Emily folded her arms, still unconvinced. "David, I understand that you want to help, but this is a big responsibility. We don't know anything about her history, or if there are other issues involved. We can't just bring a stranger home without thinking about the consequences." David nodded, understanding his wife's concerns. He put his hands on her shoulders, trying to calm her down. "Emily, I met her a few weeks ago. She seems to me a good person, a lost child who just needs a little compassion and help. She lost her grandmother recently and is completely alone. I felt it was the right thing to do." Emily sighed, softening a little, but still worried. "I understand, David, but we need to be cautious. We have to make sure that we are safe and that we can really help her in an appropriate way. We need to know more about it before making any permanent decisions." David agreed, seeing the reason in Emily's words. "You're right, Emily. Let's talk to Alice, learn more about her life, and see how we can help in a safe and efficient way. But please, let's give her a chance. She deserves it." Later that night, David and Emily were getting ready for bed. Emily lay down on the bed, but her face showed signs of worry and irritation. David knew that she still had many doubts and apprehensions about the situation. When he lay down next to her, Emily turned around, looking at him with a serious expression. "David, have you found out anything else about Alice? Anything that can help us better understand what's going on?" she asked, her voice low but charged with tension. David sighed, shaking his head. "No, Emily. She only told me about her grandmother's death and that she had been alone ever since. I didn't have time to ask more details." Emily frowned, clearly frustrated. "David, this is irresponsible. We brought a complete stranger into our home. We don't know anything about her family, her history. There may be more behind this than we are seeing." David felt bad, knowing that Emily was right in her concerns. He reached out to touch her shoulder, but Emily pulled away a little, still bored. "I know, Emily. Just me. I saw her need and acted on impulse. I wanted to help, but you're right. We need to be more careful." Emily sighed, trying to calm herself. "David, I know you have a good heart and want to do the right thing, but we can't just act without thinking. We have to be more responsible, especially when we are bringing someone into our home." David nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility. "You're right, love. Let's talk to Alice tomorrow and try to better understand her situation. And let's decide together how we can best help her." Emily looked at him, her expression softening a little, but still worried. Promise me that from now on we will do all this together, David. No more impulsive decisions. David held Emily's hand, looking her in the eyes. I promise, Emily. Let's do it together. And we're going to make sure that we're making the best decisions for all of us. Emily nodded, accepting the promise, but still with a shadow of concern in her eyes. She knew that although David's intention was good, they needed to be more careful and responsible. During breakfast, the tension in the kitchen was palpable. Emily and David were determined to learn more about Alice, but Emily's worries grew with each passing moment. They sat down at the table, with a carefully prepared meal in front of them. Alice, despite her hesitation, seemed relieved to be in a safe environment. "Good morning, Alice," said David, smiling at the girl. "I hope you slept well." "Good morning," replied Alice timidly. "Yes, thank you, Mr. David." Emily poured Alice a cup of tea, trying to hide her distrust behind a smile. David, noticing the tension, decided to cut to the chase. "Alice, we want to know more about you and how we can help," he said. "Can you tell us more about your life with your grandmother?" Alice sighed, looking at the cup of tea in her hands. "My grandmother took care of me since my parents died. She was everything to me. But when he got sick, things got tough. I did what I could to help, but she couldn't resist." Emily frowned, her suspicions growing. "And you have no other relatives? No family friend who could help?" Alice shook her head. "No, Mrs. Emily. I'm alone. I tried to find help, but I couldn't." David shot Emily a look, asking for patience. "What about school, Alice? Were you attending?" "I had to stop when my grandmother got sick a few years ago," Alice replied. "I wanted to go back, but I didn't know how." Emily, despite her reservations, decided to push a little harder. "Alice, how did you survive after your grandmother fell ill? Where did you live, and how did you feed yourself?" Alice hesitated, noticing the distrust in Emily's voice. "I stayed on the street, trying to find somewhere to sleep. I did what I could to get food." Emily folded her arms, unconvinced. "And you never thought of seeking social assistance? Go to a shelter?" Alice bit her lip, clearly uncomfortable. "I tried, but I was afraid. I've heard bad stories about these places." David intervened, trying to calm the situation. "Alice, we want to help you. We will find a way for you to go back to school and have a better life." Emily remained silent for a moment, watching Alice with an appraising look. "Alice, understand that we want the best for you, but we need to make sure we know the truth. We need to trust each other." Alice nodded, feeling the weight of Emily's words. "I understand, Mrs. Emily. I'm telling the truth. I just want a chance at a better life." David put his hand on Alice's shoulder, offering comfort. "Let's make it happen, Alice. But we need to work together." Emily, still suspicious, sighed. "Let's talk to some people today and see what we can do. But know that we need to be cautious." Emily spoke to David, expressing her serious mistrust of the girl, and asked him to find her another place. David agreed to deal with it after work, but Emily was disgusted to see him leave the girl at home. She confronted David, concerned for the family's safety. "David, I don't feel comfortable with her here," Emily said, her voice firm. "I don't trust her, and I don't want her to be around us." David tried to calm his wife, holding her hands. "Emily, I understand your concerns, but Alice needs help. I promise I'll find a solution." Emily shook her head, frustrated. "It's not safe, David. You shouldn't have left her here. What if she's dangerous?" David looked into Emily's eyes with compassion. "I know it's hard for you to trust her now, but she doesn't seem like a threat. Let's take care of this together, okay?" Emily sighed, still uneasy, but decided to trust David's judgment. "Okay, but please don't leave her alone with me again." David agreed, promising to take care of the situation as best he could. When David returned from work that afternoon, Emily was visibly agitated. As soon as he entered the house, she approached him with a worried look. "David, have you found a new place for that girl?" Emily asked, her voice heavy with tension. David sighed, running his hand through his hair. "Not yet, Emily, but I promise I will solve this as soon as possible." Emily was visibly annoyed. "How can you not have found anything yet?" "I'm worried, David. She can't stay here." David tried to calm things down. "I know, Emily, I understand your concerns, but she's not dangerous. She just needs help. Emily crossed her arms, staring at David. She's weird, David. Have you seen how she behaves? I don't feel safe with her here. David felt torn between compassion for Alice and concern for Emily. I understand how you feel. I will continue to look for a suitable place for her. Emily sighed deeply. I hope you solve it soon. I don't want this to drag on. If she doesn't get out, I'll get out of here. David nodded, hugging Emily for comfort. I will do my best. Let's talk more about this after I have news, okay? Emily agreed, but her eyes still reflected concern and irritation as David prepared to continue his search for a solution for Alice. After dinner, David stated that he would take Alice to a shelter the next day. Emily nodded with a nod, agreeing that it was better to find a solution before her son returned from camp. I'm relieved that you've decided this, Emily said, her voice a mixture of concern and relief. We can't take any chances with our son here. David held Emily's hand tenderly. I know, Emily. I'll make sure she stays in a safe place. The evening passed with an atmosphere of anxiety, but also of determination to resolve the situation. Both were aware of the need to act quickly. The next morning, David prepared to take Alice to the shelter. He explained the situation to her carefully, making sure she understood that it was temporary and for her own good. Alice accepted with resignation, thanking them for all they had done for her. When David returned home, Emily was waiting for him with a worried look, but also with a relieved countenance. How was it? Emily asked, eager for news. David sighed, sitting down next to her. It was hard to leave her there, but I think we did the right thing. She'll be safe in the shelter. Emily nodded, placing her hand on David's. You did what was necessary, David. Now we can focus on our son. They both felt a weight being lifted off their shoulders, knowing they had made a decision that would benefit everyone, especially Alice. The next morning, their son returned from camp, beaming and full of stories to tell. He sprinted through the door, clutching a backpack full of souvenirs. Daddy, Mommy, you can't believe what we did there. There was a huge trail that we explored, and we set up camp in the forest, exclaimed the boy, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. David and Emily exchanged relieved looks and smiled at seeing their son so happy and full of life. They sat at the coffee table as he described his adventures in vivid detail, as if he wanted to relive every moment with them. Now, the best part was when we made a fire and baked marshmallows late at night, he continued, laughing as he recalled the laughter and stories told around the fire. Emily put her hand on her son's shoulder affectionately. We are so glad you had so much fun, dear. How was it with your friends? The boy did not stop talking, excited to share his experiences. David looked at him with pride and relief, knowing that his safe return was the best gift they could receive. Their son asked excitedly what they had done during his time away. David, choosing his words carefully, said they had taken in a girl who had lived on the streets for a while, but now she was in a shelter. The boy smiled, curious. Was she nice? David nodded with a smile, showing a photo of her on his cell phone. The boy, seeing the picture, turned momentarily pale. Have you met her? David asked, worried about his son's reaction. The boy swallowed hard, staring at the photo for a few more seconds before shaking his head in confirmation. That girl, she's from my school. She killed her own grandmother. Thank you very much to those who have supported the channel financially through the link in the comment pinned. This helps me to bring more and more stories to you. And don't forget to like and also subscribe to continue receiving the new stories.